Barbara Hutton is usually remembered through a phrase that feels like a curse disguised as admiration. The poor little rich girl. Tabloids loved the contrast, presenting a young woman with a staggering Woolworth fortune, glittering jewels, palaces and princely husbands, yet whose life seemed to slip year after year toward loneliness and collapse. Her story is often told as a simple morality play about excess, portraying a girl who had everything and somehow lost it all. Underneath that familiar story lies a more intricate architecture of power and system failure. At age 12, Barbara inherited around $26 million from her grandmother, a sum that grew to roughly $40 to $42 million under her father's management before she reached 21. These numbers alone placed her among the wealthiest women in the world. Yet, this vast fortune sat on top of something almost invisible in the public headlines. It concealed a childhood marked by trauma and absence. The wealth did not arrive as free capital. It came packaged inside structures, trusts, managers, lawyers, and a crushing weight of social expectations and marriage market calculations. Around those structures stood women and men who understood the magnitude of a 12-year-old girl suddenly becoming a financial fact of this size. Mothers of eligible sons saw immediate possibility. Society hostesses saw spectacle. Lawyers saw both responsibility and opportunity. And a lonely child who had once found her mother's body tried desperately to find affection in a world that treated her as a prize to be negotiated. The narrative of 7 marriages, extravagant spending, and a fortune shrinking from the equivalent of hundreds of millions to almost nothing looks different within this framework. Instead of a fable about personal weakness, Barbara Hutton's life becomes a case study. It shows how dynastic money, female vulnerability, and social architecture interacted over a single fragile lifetime. The girl the world called rich was in many ways the most exposed person in every room she entered. Barbara's fortune originated from the Woolworth retail empire, the 5 and 10 cent stores that transformed American shopping habits in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Her grandmother's estate translated that retail success into a concentrated inheritance for a single child. By the time Barbara was 12, the sum set aside for her approached roughly $387 million in modern terms. This money was placed in legal structures designed to preserve the principal and provide a steady income. On paper, this resembled responsible planning. In practice, it created an impossible gap between the scale of her resources and the profound fragility of her emotional world. Her childhood home was defined equally by luxury and instability. There were grand rooms, staff, and rigid routines, but the memory of her mother's sudden death cast a long shadow. Officially, her mother, Edna, died of complications from mastoiditis. However, persistent whispers suggested something darker, that despair over her husband's infidelities and mounting social pressures had led her to take her own life. The critical, lasting detail was the image that remained with Barbara, a 4-year-old child finding her mother's body on the floor. That memory did not appear in the trust papers or legal documents. It lived instead in her private sense of safety, or the total lack of it. After Edna's death, her father, Franklin Hutton, became a sporadic presence. He was widely known as a philanderer. Business and pleasure took him elsewhere, leaving Barbara's day-to-day life in the hands of relatives, governesses, and staff. Care moved in cycles, new faces arrived, imposed routines, and then departed. Aunts and cousins stepped in and out. There was no consistent maternal figure shaping her emotional world, and no stable mother-daughter preparation for the immense social role she was expected to play. In many dynasties, mothers acted as strategic directors of their daughters' lives. They taught them how to move through drawing rooms, how to manage suitors, and how to interpret the silent codes of old money rituals. For Barbara, that vital system failed at the first link. The woman who might have been her strategic guide vanished when she was 4. No single female figure stepped into that essential role in a sustained way. Scattered women, governesses, hostesses, older relatives offered fragments of guidance without the continuity or authority a mother provides. A system designed around the maternal transmission of social knowledge tried to function without a mother at its centre. The architecture around her reflected this mismatch. She lived in large houses, suites in grand hotels, and eventually estates abroad. Yet they often lacked the deliberate strategic design seen in homes created by powerful dynasty matriarchs. There was no Caroline Astor-type figure orchestrating ballrooms and guest lists as instruments of control. In the Woolworth Hutton world, the principal female heir grew up inside borrowed structures, hotels made by other families, houses acquired rather than conceived. She was often a guest before she was ever truly a mistress. When she reached her early 20s, the world finally saw what the structures around her would produce, a debut that became legend. Her coming-out ball was lavish and theatrical. The cost, the guest list, the gowns, all signalled that a vast fortune now belonged, at least nominally, to one young woman. Society matrons watched closely, and mothers with eligible sons calculated. Editors understood this story would sell papers across the country and the globe. The phrase, "poor little rich girl," began to follow her immediately. At first, it was a slightly pitying nickname, but it quickly became the narrative frame that would define her in the public imagination. The label sounded sympathetic, yet it also functioned as a dangerous kind of permission. If she was poor in the emotional sense and rich in the financial sense, then every subsequent mistake could be folded into a satisfying cautionary tale. The system around her, lawyers, bankers, suitors, social gatekeepers, could operate with a certain impunity. Her life became both real and symbolic in the same difficult moment. The mechanisms behind her fortune were straightforward on the legal level and devastatingly complex on the human one. The Woolworth inheritance was placed in trusts with respected firms and her father managing the investments. Income flowed freely to Barbara, while the principal remained largely intact. This structure looked like protection on paper. In reality, it created a young woman who never had to consider earning money and was rarely taught how to safeguard it. Her father's role is crucial here. He competently increased the portfolio from approximately 26 million to roughly 40 to 42 million by the time she came of age. Yet his emotional presence, marked by affairs, absences, and a reputation for infidelity, undermined the trust that might have paired financial stewardship with paternal stability. The man who increased her wealth also represented betrayal in her earliest memories. Inside many dynasties, this creates a familiar pattern. Fathers handle the numbers, mothers handle the emotional and social preparation. When the maternal side collapses, daughters frequently search for substitute structures in adulthood. In Barbara's case, those structures appeared in the shape of her 7 marriages. Each union can be read as a chapter in the ongoing negotiation over her fortune, her identity, and her longing for security. Princes, counts, playboys, and men with glamorous names entered her life. Some brought titles but little money. Others offered immense charm and intensity. Several saw with startling clarity the practical implications of marrying a woman whose assets approached the equivalent of hundreds of millions. Marriage contracts and financial settlements formed the quiet, destructive legal rhythm beneath the tabloid drama. With each union, there were likely agreements about support, property, and transfers of capital. Over time, these arrangements chipped away at her once massive estate. The dramatic revelation hidden inside the numbers is simple. A fortune that could have sustained multiple generations was transformed over a few decades. It was spent on jewellery, estates, maintenance for spouses and ex-spouses, and the high cost of constant emotional flight. She was not merely passive, she made choices. She pursued certain men with great intensity, she rejected others, she divorced when situations became unbearable, exercising agency in leaving painful marriages and trying to protect her only child. But these choices unfolded within a structure where she had never been fully prepared. She could not easily distinguish love from hunger, charm from cold calculation, or devotion from strategic proximity to immense wealth. The phrase, "they married the money, not the girl," becomes less gossip and more a precise description of a recurring pattern. Husbands arrived already in need of funds, prestige, or rescue from their own financial disasters. Her fortune solved problems in multiple families, not just her own. Mothers of sons saw Barbara as an answer to mounting debts, much as earlier European aristocrats saw American heiresses as solutions to deteriorating estates. The marriage market mechanics of the Gilded Age repeated themselves in a new era. Woolworth money now served the role once played by railroads or oil. Barbara stepped into these negotiations with a desperate longing for affection that predated any legal document. That longing made her profoundly vulnerable in a structure designed to prioritize capital preservation and alliance building over emotional truth. Her personal emotional life reflected layers of unaddressed trauma. The childhood memory of her mother's death, the absence of sustained maternal care, and the knowledge, whispered or explicit, that her father's behaviour had contributed to that early tragedy all left indelible marks. The public saw extreme thinness, dependence on medication, hospitalizations, and emotional volatility. Behind those details sat a grief that never fully integrated. The girl who once found her mother's body never truly stopped looking for safety in the faces of the men she married. When she became a mother herself, she carried forward both longing and profound fear. She wanted to provide the affection she had lacked, but the patterns of instability and emotional overload made consistent parenting difficult. The very fortune that allowed her to provide schools, homes, and staff also enabled a life of constant movement, distraction, and escape. Her son grew up under the shadow of a mother whose life story was already a global headline. The decline of her fortune happened gradually, then suddenly. At its height, taking into account inflation and asset values, estimates of what passed through her hands over a lifetime approached the equivalent of $900 million. By the time she died, she occupied a far smaller space, a hotel suite, bills unpaid, resources severely diminished. The dramatic reversal is stark. The child whose trust fund once represented one of the great fortunes of her generation died with almost nothing left. Yet even in that final image, there were traces of continuity. She still surrounded herself with a small circle of loyal staff and friends. She continued to give gifts when she could, attempting generosity even as the numbers dwindled. The capacity to adorn, to give, and to care through material gestures remained long after the formal structures of wealth had collapsed. Patterns emerge when Barbara Hutton's story is placed alongside other dynastic narratives. The first pattern concerns female social control. Older women, social hostesses, gossip columnists, aristocratic matrons helped define Barbara's place long before she could define it herself. They attended her debut, evaluated her gowns, and later whispered about her mistakes. The label "poor little rich girl" circulated not only among journalists but among women who saw in her a useful cautionary tale. Unlike a matriarch who used her ballroom capacity to control access, Barbara became an object managed by other women's lists. Invitations, exclusions, and whispered judgments formed a kind of soft pervasive architecture around her. When she married a prince, some approved of the romantic elevation. When that marriage collapsed, many reinterpreted it as proof of her instability. In this way, female networks acted as both observers and enforcers of social expectations. They did not design the legal structure of her fortune, but they helped define the social script she was expected to perform. The second pattern involves the marriage market mechanics. In previous generations, American heiresses crossed the Atlantic to marry titled but financially distressed Europeans. The trade was straightforward, dollars for dukedoms. In Barbara's era, the dynamic persisted in an updated form. A Woolworth heiress, with tens of millions under management, represented precisely the kind of financial solution struggling noble families had long sought. Mothers of titled sons understood the arithmetic perfectly. A son with charm and pedigree could, with the right courtship, secure not only a wife but also capital that might rescue estates, businesses or personal fortunes. Contracts, whether formal prenups or informal understandings, governed these arrangements. The third pattern is the configuration of daughter hierarchies. Barbara did not share her fortune with sisters. She was an only child, and this removed the visible competition between sisters, between favoured and neglected daughters. Yet it intensified another hierarchy, the singular daughter upon whom all projections were placed. In families with multiple daughters, cruelty and favouritism could be distributed. In Barbara's case, the full force of expectation focused on one child. She was expected to embody the success of Woolworth money in social form. Her clothes, posture, marriages, charities and behaviour all reflected back on the name that funded it. When she faltered, there was no other daughter to correct the narrative. The poor little rich girl stood entirely alone, bearing the weight of an entire dynasty's public story. The fourth pattern concerns female resilience and ironic outcomes. In many dynastic tales, the woman's society pities at midlife emerges decades later as the quiet victor, controlling family assets and shaping foundations. Barbara's story moves in the opposite direction. She began with every possible advantage and ended in a diminished financial state. That reversal makes her an outlier among certain dynastic arcs, yet resilience can take forms not measured in bank balances. Barbara survived scandals, hospitalizations, humiliations, and betrayals. She continued to seek connection and maintained friendships. She gave away more than many fortunes ever accumulate. The ironic twist may be that her greatest impact lies not in what she preserved, but in what her life taught subsequent generations about the dangers of unstructured inheritance. Estate planners, trustees, and wealthy families studied stories like hers. The Woolworth Hutton saga became more than gossip. It served as a case study that shaped how later dynasties designed trusts, governance, and emotional support around their vulnerable heirs. The girl whose money was once left to the care of fluctuating relatives and distracted parents indirectly influenced later attempts to pair financial planning with psychological awareness. The resonance of Barbara Hutton's life extends beyond the familiar tabloid phrases. Her story illuminates the limits of wealth as protection and the ways systems can fail daughters, even when the numbers seem flawless. Her fortune began as a carefully structured inheritance from a grandmother who transformed small transactions into an empire. Legal mechanisms were put in place. Trustees watched the principal. Her father grew the portfolio. On paper, everything worked perfectly. What the system did not adequately provide was a stable emotional framework. It failed to offer a continuous mother-daughter relationship and a coherent strategy for helping a traumatized child grow into a woman capable of distinguishing predation from love. In that gap between flawless financial architecture and fragile human needs, a lifetime unfolded. Her 7 marriages trace the arc of someone trying, repeatedly, to build a home that felt safe. Each husband brought a different combination of charm, status, or profound need. Some likely cared for her in genuine ways. Others saw opportunity more clearly than they saw a person. Over time, the pattern hardened. Wealth attracted those prepared to use it. Emotional hunger made it difficult to enforce boundaries that might have preserved more of her estate and her peace. The cultural contributions associated with her world did not disappear. The Woolworth name remains part of retail history. The fortunes generated by that business funded homes, collections, travels, and charitable gestures that left their marks in cities and communities. The beauty purchased with that money, art, architecture, clothing, and decor, formed part of a broader tapestry of 20th century style and aspiration. Understanding this requires holding 2 truths at once. The fortune enabled both spectacle and genuine comfort for others. It created both excess and immense generosity. Barbara's personal legacy lives in a more delicate register. It exists in the caution her life inspired among those designing better protections for future heirs. It appears in the way later generations talk about balancing material provision with essential emotional care. Her story complicates any simple notion that money alone secures happiness, or that misfortune in the midst of wealth must always be the result of personal failing. The image of the poor little rich girl remains, but behind it stands a more intricate figure, a woman shaped by early tragedy, thrust into a global spotlight, moving through homes and husbands in search of something that the structure of her inheritance could never quite provide. Her life traces the shadows of a system that understood how to move millions between generations, yet it struggled profoundly to protect the smallest, most vulnerable person at its centre. Seen in this light, her story becomes more than a warning or a spectacle. It becomes a lens. Through it, the workings of dynastic wealth, female vulnerability, marriage markets and social judgment come into sharp focus. And within that focus lies a quiet, enduring question. What would an inheritance system look like if it were designed not only to preserve capital, but also to guard the heart of the daughter who receives it? The real story is darker, and it begins in a bedroom where a 4-year-old child found her mother's body. The trauma divided her life into a before and an after. Before, there was at least the possibility of a maternal presence, however fragile. After, there was only absence. The household reorganized around that absence. Adult relatives, staff, and lawyers moved into the vacuum where a mother should have been. The 4-year-old, who had seen more than any child should, was folded into the routines of immense wealth, new homes, new caregivers, new rules. The memory of her mother's body remained unprocessed, unspoken, and utterly formative. What followed was not the deliberate maternal strategy often seen in dynastic families, where mothers groom daughters as social assets and negotiate their futures. Instead, there was something more brutal in its simplicity, profound neglect. Her father responded to his wife's death not by stepping into an active parental role, but by withdrawing. He travelled, entertained, and delegated his daughter's care to others. The women who took her place were employees and relatives, not strategists invested in her inner life. The architecture of her childhood reflected that distance. Grand houses, luxurious suites, and carefully staffed residences surrounded her, functioning as instruments of status, but within them, the core relationship that should have anchored the child was missing. Hallways were long, ceilings high, and a child could feel very small inside such rooms, even while surrounded by every material comfort. In many dynasties, female power expressed itself through mothers orchestrating their daughters' futures. Ballrooms became stages where girls were displayed, and drawing rooms turned into negotiation chambers. Barbara's experience departed sharply from that pattern. The women who took her place could enforce rules, but not guarantee long-term attachment. Aunts and cousins could show affection, yet they did not hold the central, organising authority that a mother often wielded in dynastic households. The child learned early that care could be temporary, that people who seemed central could disappear without warning. Her feelings toward her father hardened into a tangle of fear, resentment, and frustrated longing. Sources describing her inner world speak of a daughter who felt she could never please him, who experienced his presence as judgmental and unpredictable. The man whose choices had helped destabilize her mother's life became both the source of power and the source of her deepest pain. As she grew older, the search for love and security shifted outward toward men. The pattern that developed across her relationships was not random. It echoed the early wound. She moved between seeking protection and pushing it away, between idealizing partners and feeling abandoned by them. The unresolved grief from her mother's death shaped her responses. Longing mixed with deep distrust and dependence mixed with defiance. Partners could never fully fill a role that had been vacant since childhood. The financial structures around her added another layer of complication. Her wealth attracted suitors, friends, and opportunists. Some cared for her, but others saw the fortune first. It became difficult to distinguish affection from calculation. In that respect, the architecture of trusts and inheritances protected the fortune but undermined emotional clarity. When money is always present, motives are always in question. For a woman already haunted by abandonment, this ambiguity only deepened her insecurity. Female dynamics still played a role, but often at a distance. Society matrons observed her, comparing her to other daughters of fortune, sometimes with sympathy, sometimes with thinly veiled criticism. In their circles, daughters were judged on their ability to convert inherited wealth into stable marriages and predictable futures. Barbara's struggles, public misfortunes, and visible unhappiness marked her as a cautionary figure. What could happen when emotional foundations collapsed beneath financial abundance? The missing mother remained the central absence. The label "poor little rich girl" obscures another important dimension: the way public narrative can erase the mother herself. Edna becomes a tragic prologue rather than a fully examined figure. Her despair, her isolation within her marriage, her possible decision to end her own life, these elements are often treated as background to Barbara's story. Yet understanding the daughter requires recognizing the mother's suffering. A young woman married into power, confronted with infidelity and pressure, possibly feeling there was no escape. The daughter's trauma began with the mother's. In that sense, the story rescues not one woman, but two. The absence of an autopsy, the whispered rumours, and the careful preservation of appearances all reveal how wealthy families managed scandal. Silence was a tool. Official causes were chosen. Questions were discouraged. The same mechanisms that protected the family name prevented the full truth from emerging. For those who study dynasties, this case offers a clear example of how emotional events intersect with structural decisions. The legal and financial machinery works as designed, preserving capital, but the inner life of the heir fractures. The system proves efficient at handling assets, less so at handling profound grief. The phrase "poor little rich girl" gains a different meaning when seen through this lens. It is not merely a sentimental remark about a lonely heiress. It is a shorthand for a structural failure, a dynasty that could protect its fortune with precision but could not protect its child from the consequences of adult despair and withdrawal. The phrase covers a story that begins with a silent body, a decision not to probe too deeply, and a resulting trauma that echoed through an entire dynasty, shaping one woman's fate.